Hello, my name is Daniel Fernandez. I'm the owner of scienceinhydroponics.com, and today I'm going to be doing a video about a very interesting topic, which is the topic of disinfection in hydroponics. So, we're going to talk about what disinfection is and how we can achieve it in hydroponic culture. This is very important because the solutions we use, which are water-based solutions, generally contain a lot of fungal and bacterial spores. And we want to get rid of them because otherwise they will affect our plants. So what is disinfection? So disinfection seeks to remove pathogens which are basically fungi or bacteria from solution, so that we can feed our plants without our plants getting any disease. Now, removing pathogens does not necessarily mean that we want their concentration to drop to zero, because this is most likely impossible in a hydroponic solution because of how the system works. So what we want to do is to lower their concentration, and we also want to deactivate them. This means to make conditions less favorable for their development, even if they're present to a significant extent. And of course, one thing that we want is to not kill plants, because it is very easy to sanitize a solution to make it even sterile by using various means, but then these means are also likely to hurt our plants. So what can we do that makes our solutions as close to sterile as possible, so to reduce the concentration of pathogens and deactivate them while preserving the health of our roots? So first of all, I'm going to talk about what we call physical means of disinfection, which are things that you do before the solution is in contact with plants. So I like to call these preemptive means, because they seek to prevent rather than to deal with the problem once it's already there in the roots of our plants. And these means generally happen away from plants. So this happens before our nutrient solution is ever close to our plants. So these means are what I would consider ideal and what I would recommend using as a first line of defense. From these means, the most powerful and the one that I recommend using the most frequently is UV light. So ultraviolet light will kill most pathogens if there's enough energy in the UV light. So UV lamps, research tells us that you need around 20 to 25 millijoules per centimeter squared. So you need, per area of the tube, of the quartz tube, you need at least 20 to 25 millijoules of energy to effectively sanitize the solution. However, you will see that lamps that are commercial will usually have anywhere between 1 and 250 millijoules per centimeter squared, where the 250 is the most common and the one that I would recommend. The placement of the UV system is also very important. So you will have let's say you have your nutrient reservoir here, where you keep your nutrients. You will have then some sort of pump, and you will place the UV system here between the pump and your plants. So this goes to your plants, because we want to ensure that anything that gets to the plants has been recently sanitized. Some people will build UV systems where you have a UV light that is constantly recirculating between the reservoir. This is not something I would recommend doing, because then anything that is contaminated after the reservoir will end up contaminating the plants. And you cannot guarantee that all the solution has gone through this UV filter enough, and you cannot guarantee that the walls of this container will be sanitized. So it's usually much better, and this is what I would recommend, to have the reservoir, a pump, and then the UV filter after the plants. The UV filter is not a filter, but a quartz tube that has UV light shown onto it. But we regularly call it a UV filter because of where it's placed in a system and the fact that it, quote, filters pathogens and bacteria, not by removing them, but basically by destroying them with energy. So this is the UV light. And then another thing that we have that we could use is heat. And if you want to use heat, you basically need to heat the solution to 95 degrees Celsius for at least 30 seconds. And this has been researched, and it obviously deals with bacteria and fungal spores pretty effectively. This is what is regularly done to sanitize water in small volumes. And for this reason, this is very energy intensive. So this only works if you have cheap energy. Energy is cheap. And if you have low volumes. So this way to sanitize solutions is normally only recommended in places where you have a lot of sunlight, where you can use things like solar heaters to get solution up to this temperature. If you have very low volumes, or if you have access to a very cheap form of energy, such as geothermal heating, where you can heat your solution to very high temperatures, and then you can wait for it to cool and then feed it to your plants. So this is not something I've ever seen used in practice, but it is something that is available. And finally, we also have filtration. So filtration can remove a lot of these pathogens because many are big. So fungal spores and bacteria are quite large, especially if you have things like you also have things like, for example, imagine things like amoebas that are pretty big. So you can have pathogens of that size, things like nematodes that are pretty large. And filtration will remove them very effectively. So filtration generally goes through two steps. You generally have some sort of particle filter, which is usually a fine sand filter. And then you have something like an activated carbon filter. So the problem with carbon filtration is that you cannot do it after the pump, so you cannot do it in this way because carbon filters will filtrate things like your heavy metal chelates. So you cannot filter the nutrient solution as it's going to the plants. So this is generally good to sanitize the incoming water to make sure that the incoming water that you use to create your nutrient solutions doesn't have these issues. But it is not a good solution to prevent contamination from things within the hydroponic system. So this is a problem with the filtration in that it is very useful for incoming water, but not very useful when you have a recirculating system where, for example, if you had here that you were sending this back from the plants into the reservoir, then installing a filter in the system is usually not practical. So for recirculating systems, UV is usually the best option among the physical means to do disinfection in your nutrient solution. This is all supported by research. Now, the other way we can sanitize is what I will call chemical means, which are things that we add to the solution to destroy the pathogens. So I'm going to talk about the different things we have that are chemical in nature. And let's start with hypochlorous acid. So hypochlorous acid is an oxidant, so this will generate chlorine in solution, which is a very strong oxidant, which will oxidize and therefore destroy the pathogens. Now the problem with this is that this is also, and this goes for most of these chemical means, is that this also damages roots. So hypochlorous acid, generally you'll see people selling hypochlorous acid and it can be quite expensive. But in reality, you can use sodium hypochlorite, or you can also use calcium hypochlorite. Any of these two will work, and they are the same thing. Basically, when you put this in solution, you get sodium and you get hypochlorite ions, and when you set these to the pH, so when we move this to pH 5.8, which is the pH in hydroponics, then you'll get the hypochlorous acid. So buying this is the same as buying this, and then you put it in a hydroponic system and you lower the pH and you get exactly the same thing. So it is not worth it to just buy pure hypochlorous acid. You can just buy sodium or calcium hypochlorite and it is going to be the same thing. So if you use these are usually used in a concentration of 5 to 10 ppms, and you can control their concentration using strips to measure free chlorine, and you generally want to keep your free chlorine in the 1 to 2 ppm range. So this is of free chlorine. And you have strips that test for free chlorine, and you can therefore use these test strips to add 5 to 10 ppms and get this concentration. So generally you'll start by adding this, and then these will be replenished once every 24 hours, 12 to 24 hours, depending on how many pathogens you have in solution and how these free chlorine concentration changes. But these will be damaging to your roots. So this stresses roots out, and roots do not have a mechanism to deal with hypochlorous very effectively. So this is a solution that is good for shock, like if you have a very big pathogen problem and you need to reduce it now, then these can work to alleviate the problem, but it is not a solution that you want to use for the long term, or that you do not want to keep your system doing this sort of oxidation all the time. Now the next thing we have is ozone, which is O3. So ozone is very popular, and generally the way you use it is that you will use an ozone generator, and you will inject it to reach an ORP that is at least or greater than 750 millivolts. So you'll have an ORP meter, which is basically a platinum wire, and you will measure the potential of the solution, and you will try to keep it at least at 750 or more using ozone. It has several different problems. So you'll see in the literature there are many papers where they use ozone and nothing happens, and this can be done, but it has many bad things that can happen. So first is that it is a very powerful oxidant. So it can oxidize chelates, so it can damage heavy metal chelates. Another problem that it has is that it can precipitate oxides, precipitate metal oxides. So things, for example, like manganese, you can precipitate manganese oxide. So there are many things that, many oxides that can precipitate, because ozone increases the potential of the solution so much that a lot of these oxides become stable enough to precipitate even at the pH values we use in hydroponics. The other thing is that it's very reactive, so it can react with other chemicals. So for example, it can react with chlorine you have, so with hypochlorite you have in solution from your water supply, and generate chlorates. So it can generate nastier chemicals from chemicals that are already in your water. So generally what people will do is that they will need it to decay. So they will place it in a tank, and then they will wait till the ORP drops and the ozone decays before using the water. And this happens better at higher pH. So at higher pH, the decay is faster. If you have low pH, then ozone is pretty stable. So at the pH in hydroponics, ozone will be pretty stable. So you want to do ozone before, when the pH of the water is higher. For example, if you have city water and the pH is around 7.5, you do it there, you wait for it to decay, and then you use it. Some people use ozone, they do not wait for it to decay, then add the nutrients, then use it without problems, but that can be very problematic. And I've had several different customers who've had problems with ozone in this manner. Then we have another possibility, which is very popular, which is hydrogen peroxide. So hydrogen peroxide has very significant advantages in that when it decomposes, it only generates water and oxygen. It is generally used in the 5 to 10 ppm range, and this is usually a concentration that is added again every 12 hours. So add peroxide so that you have a total concentration in this range. And usually the problem with this is that these concentrations are generally ineffective to actually oxidize pathogens. So this will sort of keep them at bay, but it will not prevent infection. So if you have a pathogen problem and you add peroxide, then you need to add a lot more. You need to add 25 to 50 ppms. And then this is effective, but then these can damage roots. However, plants can adapt to peroxide significantly. So what you will do if you want to use peroxide is that you start at this low concentration. You start at 5 to 10 ppms, and then the plants can adapt to it, and older plants that have been treated with 5 to 10 ppms will then be able to deal with 25 to 50 because they've built adaptations in the root system. This is all stressful to plants, so it's not something that you should ideally use. It is also true that we also have a catalase containing pathogens. And these pathogens are resistant to peroxide because they can actually eliminate peroxide using catalase, which is the same enzyme that plants use to protect themselves from it. So there are some pathogens that are catalase rich, and these pathogens will absolutely survive peroxide. So hydrogen peroxide is not a cure for everything. Then we also have a peracetic acid in the same lane as peroxide, which is usually you have peroxide and you add acetic acid to it, and then this generates peracetic acid, which is a stronger oxidant. But this is toxic in very low concentrations. Even 0.5 to 5 ppms are already toxic to plants. And plants cannot adapt to peracetic acid as effectively as they do to peroxide. So I do not like using peracetic acid very much. Although a lot of people use it because of how aggressive it can be. If peroxide is to be used, which I do not like to use it either, then I would suggest you start at this low concentration so that the plants can start adapting to it, and then you ramp it up to a higher concentration once the plants have adapted, which usually takes 1 to 2 weeks. Finally, I want to talk about something that is not very discussed, which is iodine, or iodine. I don't know how it's pronounced, I2, which is elemental iodine. And this is actually pretty effective for fungi. So this is very effective to deal with fungi, and it is actually pretty effective in a very small concentration range. So 0.5 to 0.8 ppms are usually enough to kill fungi. So while iodine is not going to be very effective against bacteria or against anything else, it is effective against fungi, and it is a good stopgap solution if you are not able to implement anything else, but you want to have something that is going to be pretty innocuous to plants, but that will help you fight the pathogens. Then elemental iodine in this concentration will be a good choice. And this will be absolutely non-toxic to plants, as far as I've seen in the species where I've tried it, which are basically leafy greens, where I've tried to implement this with some growers. Now, my absolute recommendation is to use UV. UV can destroy some heavy metal chelates because of its oxidation power, especially if the solution is recirculated through the UV filter a lot. So in this case, adding excess chelating agent helps do this, but the chelate destruction is not big enough that you shouldn't use it. So it's always a problem that you can deal with, and it shouldn't be something that makes you ignore UV, because it is absolutely the best solution. So this will be my #1 suggestion, will be to use UV in your crop. If you already have a pathogen problem and you didn't have UV and you want to install it, but you want to deal with things, then among the oxidants that you can use, then peroxide is, depending on the pathogens you have, peroxide might be a good choice. Hypochlorite is usually a more aggressive choice that works for a wider variety of pathogens. So if you don't know what's going on, then sodium hypochlorite is a good choice because it is very wide acting. It is not that harsh against plants, and you can use it at this concentration, and it will be pretty effective at dealing with things. If the pathogens are peroxide sensitive, then starting with low concentrations of peroxide and then increasing to high concentrations can help. But right here, we're talking about damage control already. If we're talking about preventing and actually doing things right, then first step, install a UV filter. Then second step, make sure your incoming water is sand filtered and filtered with activated carbon so that you can remove anything that comes in. And then by following these steps, we will ensure that your crop is properly sanitized and your water is always It has as low of a pathogen loading as possible. Now, ozone is not something I would recommend because I've experienced all sorts of problems with growers going from, I've had colleagues talk about precipitation of oxides, not something I've experienced on my own, but something I've been discussing with people. I've also experienced oxidation of chelates. I've also experienced reactions with other chemicals that generate problems with plants. So ozone is something that I would absolutely not recommend, and it's also a harmful gas to the people who actually work around the plants. So I wouldn't use ozone at all. I would use UV and sand filtration, and then if I need to, then I would go to either hypochlorites or peroxides, depending. I would not want to use peracetic acid, so this is something I do not like using because of how toxic it can be. I prefer simple peroxide, which is also significantly cheaper than the peracetic acid variants. Also, if you want to prevent, but you don't have this yet, and you're not gonna put it in, then iodine is also a good choice that can be put in place to prevent some of these fungal diseases without harming the plant. So it's a good way to maintain low level of fungal disease without having any of these like strong oxidant effects on the plants. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot about disinfection. Of course, there's a lot more to talk about in disinfection in hydroponics. This is just a small summary of what I believe are the main aspects of this topic. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one, and bye-bye.